All right, dear Kirsten and Thomas, we are live on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's honor to have you today. And let's wait our viewers. So we take some time. They will receive notification and will join us soon. Oh, already, yes. People starting to join us. So, good evening, dear friends. We are very happy to come back with our regular program, Virtual US State Tours. And today we are going to visit Minnesota State. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speakers today. Kirsten Brooke Salinger, she is a Deputy Director in the Office of Economy Policy in the State Department Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And prior to this assignment, she served as a Public Affairs Officer in the U.S. Embassy Bishkek from 2018 to 20, and she's from Minnesota. And our next guest speaker is Thomas Salinger. He is a director of the Office for Europe and Eurasia in the State Department Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. And previously, he was chief of the political economic section of the U.S. Embassy Bishkek. And he was born and raised in Minnesota. So today I think we are very lucky to have you guys, and we have amazing tour guides who will make a presentation about Minnesota State. So dear friends, please be active and ask your questions during the live. You can type them in the comment section, and after the presentation, I will read them aloud to the presenters. So let's get started, and the floor is yours, dear Kirsten and Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's really nice to be back in Bishkek. We lived in Bishkek until last year and miss it very, very much. So if we can't be with you at the library in Bishkek, at least we're sending ourselves to you this evening. So thank you. Thank you so much for letting us come talk to you a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Wonderful. I think I can share your presentation. Yes, and
there we go, back to the top. Great. So, so we're both from Minnesota. They call it the land of 10,000 lakes. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. And but right now we live in Washington D.C. because of our jobs with the State Department. But we get back to Minnesota where our families are as often as we can. So, do you want to do next slide?
Sure. Next slide.
Oh, it's me. So here I am. Yes, and so we lived in Bishkek for 2 years. And I've been in the Foreign Service for 23 years now. And that was probably the best assignment ever in Bishkek. So next slide.
So I am also a Foreign Service officer. And as we mentioned, we were in Bishkek the past few years. In our business, in our jobs, we move around a lot. And so we are in Washington, D.C. right now. But we've lived in the Caribbean and in different parts of Europe. And then, of course, most recently in Kyrgyzstan. I also am originally from Minnesota. So both Tom and I are from the Twin Cities. So St. Paul is the capital, and Minneapolis, where Tom is from, is the largest city in Minnesota. We both were raised there and went to school there. I actually moved away for university and went to moved to a couple other places, and then came back and lived in Minnesota in my mid-20s, I would say, until joining the State Department. So we actually, well, you can tell, I guess you've lived there for a little bit longer.
Yeah, why don't we go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is the family in Bishkek. We have 4 children, but 2 of them were young enough to be with us in Bishkek. And so going to the Nomad Games, we went there just after we arrived in 2018. And then the other photograph is us not far from Alarcha, which was one of our favorite places to go to. And yes, and we talk about it all the time. Next slide, Aida. And then we have our bigger family. So here's our big kids, and our grandson is in this picture, and our oldest daughter's husband in the center there with the grandson. So the kids who have graduated from our house are in Minnesota, along with Kirsten's parents and all of our siblings. So we get back there as often as we can to see them. Next slide, Aida.
So this is Minnesota on a map, and you can see that the state is very much in the middle. We are so far away from ocean. It's probably as far as you can get.
Oh, not almost as far as Kyrgyzstan is from the ocean.
Probably. And we're also very far north. So Minnesota actually borders Canada. The gray above the state is Canada, and we're right on the border. Kind of an interesting fact, and I can show in the next slide, but before we go to that, is that we touch the Great Lakes areas. So on the map, the big body of water that is next to Minnesota is called Lake Superior. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it is part of what's known as the Great Lakes. And it is the farthest west of the Great Lakes. But that system, that river and water system, basically does connect to the ocean for all the way from Minnesota to the Atlantic Ocean through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. So that has become an important resource for the state of Minnesota in accessing, for example, ports and for exporting products out to the rest of the world.
And you can add too that the Mississippi River also reaches the Gulf of Mexico. So we touch the Gulf of Mexico also by river.
So even though we are thousands of kilometers away from the ocean, there is enough water, waterways to access those oceans. Next slide. This is a closer up picture or map of the state of Minnesota. The map on the left really kind of shows you how flat the state is. Generally speaking, there is not much elevation. We do not have anything at all like the beautiful mountains of Kyrgyzstan. Not at all. There's a few, let's say, bluffs, which would maybe, they don't even compare. There are several hundred meters, but that is the highest elevation up in the north. The northeastern part, right next to Lake Superior, there's some bluffs, but that's about it. So not much mountain climbing or skiing, but we do what we can. And on the right, I think what is very unique about Minnesota is the number of lakes. So Tom mentioned it's called the land of 10,000 lakes. You can see here, it's sort of dotted with lots and lots of bodies of water. And so there's actually more than 10,000 lakes. There's about 15,000 lakes. Almost everyone has access to a lake, whether it's large or small. In fact, Minneapolis is called the City of Lakes, and that's because no home is more than 10 blocks, which is
a mile maybe, or somewhere.
Even
Not quite a mile.
Probably a kilometer from a lake. So pretty much everyone can walk to some kind of lake, big or small. The other thing I just wanted to mention a little bit on the theme of water is what makes Minnesota unique is that it is the beginning of the Mississippi River. So right at the center of the state is a lake called Lake Itasca, and that is the headwater of North America's largest river called the Mississippi. The border of Minnesota on the west is called the Red River, and that river actually flows north up to Canada. So that's something very unique. And then the border to the east, which is the border in between Minnesota and the next state of Wisconsin, that is also a river called the St. Croix. So when you grow up in Minnesota, you just grow up in or around water, whether it's a lake or a river. It's always fresh water, but that's something very integral to, our sports and our pastimes, and taking picnics and things like that is very much part of what many people do. Next slide, please.
So as I mentioned, it's called the land of 10,000 lakes. It's also called the North Star State. That's our state motto, I guess, that appears on in our state seal. And that is because we're up in the north of the continent. And often in the northern part of the state, you can see the Northern Lights, which is a fantastic natural experience. We have been a state since 1858. So we were one of the it was the 32nd state out of 50. So we came a bit later, and we're settled a little bit later than the East Coast. As Kirsten mentioned, her hometown, St. Paul, is the capital city, and the population of the state is right about 5.5 million people. And about just over half of those people live in those twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, which are both next door to each other across the Mississippi River. So next slide, Aida. So when most Americans think of Minnesota, they think of cold because it has a very, very long winter. It often will start snowing in late October or early November, and there will be snow on the ground until April. So, but we do make the most of it. We have a very good system for keeping the roads cleared and sidewalks cleared so that people can go about their daily lives. But then also we have a great appreciation for things you can do outside in the cold. So things like you'll see in the upper right corner, a snowmobile. Those are very popular. They were invented in Minnesota and they're quite popular. People play hockey on the lakes. There's so much ice around that the hockey is a very big sport. People do go skiing. Cross-country skiing, Nordic skiing is a little bit more world class in Minnesota than downhill skiing, than skiing in the mountains. So, but people still do a lot of downhill skiing as well. In Kirsten's hometown of St. Paul, they have an a winter carnival, they call it, which is basically an ice festival where they make ice castles and they have parades down the frozen streets. So we try to make the most of it. And it's very much a part of the culture. We think of ourselves as tougher than the rest of the country because we can survive a Minnesota winter. So next slide. And then here you get a view of what I just called the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the upper left is my hometown of Minneapolis, which is the biggest city and kind of the economic heart of the state. And then on the upper right is the state capitol in Kirsten's hometown of St. Paul. And that is obviously the government seat of the state. And these two cities are right across the Mississippi River from each other, and are very much connected. But it is kind of comical, I guess, that people in Minneapolis tend to just do everything in Minneapolis, and people in St. Paul tend to stay in St. Paul. So, our marriage, a Minneapolis person marrying a St. Paul person, is kind of a mixed marriage in our state. Did you want to add? As we talk about the geography of the state, in the lower right, you'll see one of the lakes. That's very typical of the northern half of Minnesota. And then the big farm in the lower left is very typical of the southern half of Minnesota. And the Twin Cities are kind of 2/3 down the state, so more in the agricultural side of the state.
One thing just to mention about the two cities is that Minneapolis was settled by Europeans as the highest navigable part of the Mississippi River. So that's the farthest north that you can get big boats on the river. And it became a center for agriculture. And so as farmers were growing wheat, mostly wheat, but
corn too.
But corn as well, that Minneapolis became the center for milling, for creating the flour, and for storing it and then putting it on boats and getting it down the river. So the downtown high-rises that you see used to be granaries, grain silos, and that's why the city was settled there. St. Paul is about 10 kilometers south on the Mississippi River, as the river curves around, but that was actually settled primarily as as a port that was able to take more boats and provide trade and transportation. So both of them are located, both the downtowns are located where they are because of that kind of agricultural and trade location. Next slide. So this is just a little introduction into the different animals that we have that are kind of typical. The upper right photo is just a typical picture. We have a lot of forests, and timber was a big industry, and there are a lot of animals that live in the forest that are kind of unique. So to the left is a picture of two moose, and I'm not sure if that's a familiar animal to you or not, but they're big and they can be very aggressive if you bother them, and they like to live in sort of watery areas. The photo below that is another creature that loves trees. It's a beaver. And when settlers came, they were French settlers in the 1700s. The reason they loved this part of the country was there were so many beaver furs, and that became kind of one of the industries. Was they came to Minnesota and started hunting and trapping for this beautifully soft animal fur. The photo on the far right, bottom right, might be hard to see, but it is a pack of timber wolves. And wolves are native to Minnesota. And There are still very active and healthy wolf populations in the northern part of the state. And for a very long time, they were also hunted and trapped, and in much of America became extinct, with the exception of Minnesota and Alaska. So that's something that is still unique to our state, is that we have wolves, and we have a lot of protection for those wolves.
And they've used these wolves to reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone and other places in the American West.
And then in the middle is our state bird, and that bird is called the loon, and it's very pretty. I really like this bird. And you can see one of the unique things is that the mother carries the baby on its back. And I think Aida has
maybe you can click on it.
Oh, did she do that?
Or she's clicking on it. Okay, here you go.
She can click on this bird. It has a very unique sound.
There he goes. So that is in northern Minnesota, the far north up by Canada. There's a place called the Boundary Waters, which is a place where you can go in a canoe and carry your canoe, and then carry your canoe between the lakes. We're losing it. And you can carry your canoe between the lakes, and people go camping there. And that sound is just like the iconic sound of that part of the state. And it's just, one of my favorite places in the world.
Okay, so, next slide.
I think that's me? Okay. So Kirsten mentioned earlier, Lake Superior, it touches northeastern Minnesota. So we have quite a long coastline on Lake Superior. It's the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. I think Lake Baikal in Russia has more water in it because it's so deep. But if you look at it on a map, Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world. They actually say it contains 10% of all of the fresh water that's accessible, to people on the Earth's surface. And then you get some statistics there about the dimensions, but 560 kilometers long. And it is the beginning of the Great Lakes waterway system that goes through the lakes and all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, as Kirsten mentioned. So a big industry in northern Minnesota was actually mining for iron ore. And there was a whole big mining industry there. And the iron ore would go to Duluth, which is a port at the very tip of Lake Superior on the far western side of the lake. And it would get loaded onto these huge barges, and then it would get carried down to the steel mills down in Ohio or Pennsylvania. And that was a big part of the Minnesota economy, I would say in the early to mid 1900s, probably. And so we were a big part of the steel industry. But because of that, there was a lot of traffic on the lakes with these giant barges, which are, 1,000 feet long, which I'm trying to think of what that is in meters. About 1,000 meters. No, about 300 meters. 300 meters long, these really huge ships. And it's a stormy lake too. And so there are a lot of shipwrecks on the lake as well. And so there've been some famous famous shipwrecks that have taken place there. But it's a tremendous resource. The coastline is absolutely beautiful. People go sailing on the lake. It's a very special part of Minnesota.
And it's very cold.
Yes, the water is very cold.
So you would never, you can maybe swim in it in July and August, but it's very, very fresh. Like it never gets above, I would say 17 or 18 degrees. Mm-hmm. So it's fresh.
Yeah, very cold. Next slide. And the Minnesota economy. So it was built, as Kirsten mentioned earlier, it was built on agriculture, and that's still very important to Minnesota. So we're one of the top producers in the United States for corn, sugar beets, peas, oats. We have a special product called wild rice that I don't know that you ever see in Central Asia, but it's a very special kind of rice that grows wild. And then we're also, a big producer of soybeans and wheat and canola. And then a lot of businesses have grown up around that agriculture. So we have big agricultural trading companies and food processing companies as well, where they make cereal and process meat as well. We also produce a lot of cattle and hogs and things like that. And then another important part of our economy is the medical industry. At the University of Minnesota, which is in the Twin Cities, they actually invented the artificial heart. And there are a lot of companies that have grown up around what we call the medical devices industry. So that's another important part of our economy. And then banking and lots of other businesses. I think that's
the last one down at the bottom is called 3M, and it stands for Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. And you might have heard of the Post-it note, so the little
sticky note,
little sticky notes, and that was actually invented by accident by that company. Because one of the researchers and scientists was actually looking for glue, for a kind of glue product, and ended up finding that paper had the right characteristics to be a Post-it note. So that's one of our one of our famous products. Next slide. So one of the things I thought might be interesting is to talk about the people and culture, kind of cultural history in Minnesota. And I think one of the things that makes us unique is our significant Native American population. So before European settlers came in the mid 1800s, there were many North American Native American tribes, and generally speaking, again, to kind of divide the state into, let's say, two parts. The northern part, which was very forested and lake and had a lot of lakes, has the Sioux, different Sioux tribes. And the South, which is primarily, which was mainly fields and plains Indians, were Dakota Indians. And so you can see on the right, the green and red are the tribal reservations that exist in Minnesota right now. And so there's a lot of different communities that have tribal rights on those reservations. And then on the left are a few names of the tribes and a few, photos of historical photos of their culture and representation. So that's certainly something that is unique to our state and a part of, our current kind of cultural celebrations and awareness. Next slide. So these are photos of some early Minnesota immigrants. Early meaning around the 1850s and 60s. Most people who came were Northern Europeans. So primarily from Sweden and Norway and Germany. On the left, you'll see the kinds of equipment that they used as farmers. Finns, people from Finland, settled more in the north, where there were forests. There was a lot of timber and mining, as Tom mentioned, and so that was typically where they would settle. Next slide. In recent decades, our immigration patterns have changed, and we have a lot of immigrants, particularly to St. Paul and Minneapolis, who are from Laos. On the right, you'll see some members of the Hmong community, which is an ethnic population from Laos who have really done well in the agricultural business in Minnesota. And then on the left are people from the Somali community who generally have settled in Minneapolis. And then also we have recent immigrants from Mexico who typically have settled in the southern part of the state where there's a lot of agriculture and food business as well. Next slide, please.
Every big American city has to have professional sports teams. So the Twin Cities are home to some team from pretty much all of the major sports in the United States. So we have American football with the Vikings in the upper left, and then the Minnesota Twins baseball team. We have a men's basketball team and a women's basketball team, and a professional soccer team or European football team, and a hockey team, of course, which is a big deal. So those are, each one has its own stadium, which usually, well, it depends, but anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 people in each of these stadiums. So that's another part of our tourist economy, I guess. Next slide. And we don't have a lot of famous Minnesotans. We're pretty modest people, but there are a few that maybe you've heard of. In the upper left, you'll see the musician Prince. And in the lower right, the musician Bob Dylan. So those are two who've become famous. In the very center, it's Judy Garland, who was an actress who was in The Wizard of Oz and was very famous in the 30s and 40s and 50s. The upper right is the cartoonist Charles Schulz, who created Snoopy and Charlie Brown, which very, very iconic American cartoons. And then in the lower left, F. Scott Fitzgerald was a writer. He wrote books like The Great Gatsby, was very popular in the 1920s, I guess. Next slide. But today, I guess one of the most famous Minnesotans is George Floyd, who you've probably heard of, who was murdered last May, just about a year ago, by a Minneapolis police officer. And his death sparked protests around the world, really amazing protests. We were in Minnesota, living there kind of temporarily during the pandemic when he was murdered, and were part of all of the, witnessed the sort of unleashing of public sentiment calling for racial justice. And it was a humbling experience, I would say. And hopefully the United States is moving in a better direction when it comes to racial justice, thanks to George Floyd. Did you want to add anything on that?
I don't think so. Those are just some photos. The art is some photos from from near where we are from, which is very close to where he died. And a lot of people chose to make very artistic tributes on the storefronts or on the storefronts, basically. So that's what those pictures are, in tribute to him. And they are still up, actually. And one of the things that some people we know that are involved with the museum is they're actually creating an exhibit of all of the temporary artwork that was created last year to make sure that it's preserved. So that's just a couple photos.
Yeah, because a lot of where we were in Minneapolis, they boarded up all with plywood, just flat wood, all of the windows of the shops so they wouldn't get broken during the riots, or to close them up after they were broken. And so most of this art is just painted on plywood. But it was a moving scene when it was happening. And I think that's the last slide, right?
Yeah,
so
that's it.
We'd be happy to take questions.
You can go back to the first, maybe the first.
Well, actually,
I think we have to. Okay.
There.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, dear Kirsten and Thomas, for the fantastic, lovely presentation. I think it was great to go virtually to Minnesota. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Yes, we started to receive a lot of questions and comments. So beautiful. These buildings looks like the White House, but I don't know which building.
Oh, the one that was from a different city, I think. Some of those pictures from around the world, yeah.
Great. The next question. Hello, Kirsten and Thomas. Thanks for great presentation. Virtual hug. And I would like to know. Are there unusual facts about Minnesota?
Oh, well, two things that I can think of is that we actually have something called the State Fair, and many states in America have these things called state fairs, which happen right around harvest time. And as we mentioned, Minnesota is very agricultural. So even though we're not very big, we're not like Texas, we have a very big state fair. And in fact, it's the second largest state fair in America. And it's huge. And everyone, kids and old people, like everybody goes to the fair, and you walk around, and there's carnival rides, and you see the animals, the cows and the chickens and everything. But there are a couple things that we're famous for. And one is that we have a sculpture made out of butter every year, and it's always a picture of the beauty queen. I don't know how to say that, really. I don't know if people know that, but and then we're also known for having food that is always fried and on a stick. And so you will eat everything that is very, very unhealthy, but really, really tasty. And that millions and millions of people come to this fair in August.
Yeah, very.
So I'll just
great.
I can tell you that I also just looked up the average temperature of Minnesota, just because our winters are so cold. And the average for the whole year is 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is maybe 6 degrees. 6 degrees Celsius is the average temperature for the year.
Oh.
But it gets very hot in the summer, but very, very cold in the winter.
Oh, yeah, it's cold. Thank you, Kirsten and Thomas, for sharing these unusual facts about Minnesota. Let me ask the next question. Is it true that Minnesota state have tax-free shopping?
Yes, and actually that is another good unusual fact. we do have tax-free shopping. So if you
For-
want to buy clothes or
for
anything,
clothing, yes. For
yeah.
clothing and food. I
For
think.
clothing and food, because those are like essential things that people need to live. But we also have the largest shopping mall, at least in North America. I don't know if it's in the world, but I'm guessing it's probably the largest shopping mall in the world. And it's located right next to our airport. So a lot of people from America, but also from places like Japan, will fly in directly to the airport and go right to the shopping mall because there's hundreds and hundreds of stores and there's no tax. Yeah.
It's kind of dream for shopping lovers. Thank you. Yeah, Kirsten and Thomas. Let me ask you the next question. Dear Kirsten and Tom, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is, what does the Minnesota name mean?
It comes from Native American languages. I think it's the Lakota language. And Minnie means water, and soda is the color of the sky. So it means water that's the color of the sky. So one of our beer companies made that into Land of Sky Blue Waters, is the sort of the fancy version of it. So Minnesota is water colored but like the sky, and then Minneapolis then means it's a combination of Lakota and Greek, I guess, city of water. So, and we have a lot of Native American names around the state. Years.
I see. Thank you for the explanation, Thomas. So let me read other questions that we received in other social networks. So Minnesota is obviously a northern state. Is there an unspoken division between the north and the south of the U.S.?
Interesting. There's definitely a cultural division. The people are different, I guess. We're known.
It's maybe not unspoken because
talk about it.
I do think people talk about the North and the South in America for sure, culturally.
Yeah.
I mean, we would say we're from the North, but we kind of are thinking, okay, it's cold, like it's very, very cold. And people from the South do not want to live in the North because just it's so cold. But there's more than that. It's the cultural history of the Civil War, which was North and South. And so I think, America is so big that it's not just North and South. It's like groups of states, I think, have different foods and different cultures and different geography that, people tend to think more in smaller terms sometimes than all of America. So it could be North, but it could be, we're also considered what's called the Midwest. And so there's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 states that have very similar aspects. Like agriculture is very much what the Midwest sort of means. So I think it's true. People do think about it, and it's very much like spoken. People think about it that way and talk about it.
And I think the folks who live in the North, think of themselves as, well, from Minnesota especially, very humble, but also very polite and very hardworking, I think. And people in the South, how we view them is more maybe relaxed and
friendly, but also more like open.
And maybe a slower, very hospitable, and maybe a slower pace of life. But then I think when you look back at the Civil War too, we like to think of ourselves as on the right side of history, with the Union and freeing the slaves. But I think with George Floyd, we learned that Minnesota is not, as good as we might hope it is when it comes to racial justice. So I think that was an eye-opening event for Minnesotans, for sure.
Yes. Thank you very much, Thomas and Kirsten. Oh, let me. It was asked already. Sorry. Oh, thank you for interesting presentation. Kirsten, Thomas, I love Bob Dylan songs.
Yes. Wait, he's still making music. He's
Yeah.
still out there.
The question is, what do you miss most about Kyrgyzstan?
For me, maybe the mountains. It's because we don't have mountains in Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean,
So
we loved hiking every weekend, and the air is so
Yes.
fresh, like particularly up in the mountains. I think that's something that we miss because here there's a lot of like humid, it's very wet air and hot, and Kyrgyzstan was so beautiful and fresh. And our whole family would just love to go up, love to go into the mountains and just go hiking. And I also miss just the animals, like the horses and the sheep, and just being kind of close to nature in that sense.
I think I miss the people and how they were so connected to nature. And I think of one time we were at Songkul, and we were on a little horseback riding trip, and there was a guy who was our tour guide, and we were riding around the lake, and suddenly he says, "Oh, just a minute," and he jumped into this little Kokbaru match that was happening right there. And it was just so funny because he just said, "Hang on a second," and he ran in and started anyway, so I miss that love of nature that people have.
Oh, wonderful. So many warm memories about Kyrgyzstan. So how many regions did you visit?
Gosh, I went to Osh, and we went to Songkul, we went all around Isikul, Karakol. We never got up to the northwest though, to
Narin. Yeah, we didn't go to Narin.
Yeah, so we didn't.
Actually, that's maybe Minnesota weather is maybe a little bit like Narin.
Yeah,
I think we were talking about going, and then there was the underpass was closed. The tunnel,
the snow. There was too much
something.
snow.
So that's kind of what Minnesota's like all the time.
I see. Yes, I was thinking about that when I saw these pictures snowing.
Yeah, it's beautiful though. You learn.
Yes, it's beautiful. Yes. Thank you, dear Kirsten and Thomas. So the next question is: you have mentioned the Native Americans in Minnesota. Are there any museums or cultural centers of the Native Americans there?
Yes, there are. There are cultural centers. There are also museums. Some of the history is quite sad, and so there are museums that commemorate different battles that happened between the settlers and the native tribes, and so we try to remember, that history. But I would say the most often you will see, for instance, at the state fair, but at different smaller events like a county or a little city event, you'll see Native American groups either doing dances or celebrating, making craft items or something.
Yeah, there's also in Minneapolis, very close to where I grew up, there's a a Native American. It's a reservation actually. That's their land, but there's like a cultural center, an art center, and they actually can choose a different education system. So there are schools in Minneapolis where the education focuses a lot more on their culture and their language and their history. And so that's just right in the city, like maybe 2 kilometers from where I grew up. So it's not just a museum. There are museums. There's something called the History Museum that that covers the historical aspect, but it's very much like woven into the neighborhoods or the state. And there's actually a very kind of famous chef who runs a restaurant called Sous Chef, which is like Sioux is the name of the tribe, but then a sous chef in French is also a chef, and he's become very famous for kind of introducing Sioux cooking, the kinds of foods that they eat, to the rest of Minnesota, I guess. So it's very much like part of the current culture as well.
I see, it's so interesting. Thank you very much. Oh, I lost myself in comments. So many comments here. Okay. Is Minnesota State famous for medical field?
It is. I think I mentioned that the University of Minnesota Research Hospital invented the artificial heart. And there's also a hospital south of the Twin Cities called the Mayo Clinic, which is one of the best hospitals in the world, and people come from all over the world for treatment there. And a lot of companies, make what we call medical devices. I'm trying to think of examples. Things like
pumps, like pumps that go into your body.
Things like for people who, for treatment for a heart attack, they expand your veins, little stints and stuff like that. There's all kinds of, very interesting medical products that I don't really know.
Yeah. And then the other thing, recently, at least in America, we have seen someone on TV a lot from Minnesota. He is a epidemiologist, and he's been well known for like maybe 20 or 30 years now, but he's been on national TV a lot because of the COVID pandemic. I would say over the past year, he's not Dr. Fauci, but he is someone who is very recognized in the medical field in the U.S. So that's because of the University of Minnesota. It does a lot of epidemiology research. So.
Yes, I read about Mayo Center, if I am not mistaken. It's very famous in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Thank you, dear Kirsten and Tom. Oh, thank you, Tom and Kirsten. It's so great to see and listen to you. That was really interesting. Wish I could visit one day your state.
You're very, very welcome.
Yes.
It's not a place that a lot of people visit, to be very honest. Like most people want to go to New York,
Disney World,
Los Angeles. But I would say if you come, please come in the summer. Don't come in the winter because you might be scared. But it is absolutely beautiful in the summer, like June, July, August, and people are very, very friendly.
Oh, great. So we received similar, like one question, one comment, like, and I also like your decorative plate on the wall. And place from Kyrgyzstan.
Yes. The big middle one is from Turkey, but the rest are all from Kyrgyzstan.
Yes. This is our dining room. Yeah.
Wonderful. They're really beautiful. And thanks for wonderful presenting. I love this state because I visited in 2017. And which Minnesota hockey team are you?
Yes, the Minnesota Wild is our hockey team. Although long time ago we used to have the Minnesota North Stars, was our hockey team, and they moved to Dallas. It was a tragedy, but then the Minnesota Wild came down. So That's our favorite team.
I mean, all your family, not just part of your family fans of one team, another.
Oh,
Everybody likes the Wild.
yeah. It's just one team. But then, of course, we have a lot of smaller teams like high school, and then, of course, universities. You know, every school has a hockey team. Like, and now, actually, this was not the case when we were young. We're a little bit older, but now girls play hockey. So there's a lot of high school teams that have girls and boys teams, which is really fun. So there are a lot of teams, but we just we only get to watch the professional ones on TV. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you, Thomas and Kirsten. And one more question. Thank you for the presentation. My question for you, if you could name 3 things that remind you of Minnesota, what would they be?
Good question.
I don't know that it's a thing, but actually the first picture of our slide, of our presentation, is to me like how I grew up and what reminds me of Minnesota. So the boat is called a canoe, and I always grew up in that boat on a lake in the forest. Like maybe that's 3 things right there. But that's what reminds me of Minnesota.
And I would say that loon call that we listened to is immediately that for sure.
Yes, it's very iconic, unique sound. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing this, Kirsten and Thomas. And I think it would be the last question to be asked. What other U.S. state would you like to live in?
I don't know.
Kirsten used to live in Colorado, and that's mountainous and more like Kyrgyzstan, actually. So that might be.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And actually, it's funny because when I was in Bishkek, it always reminded me of Colorado because it has beautiful, beautiful mountains, and the air is like very clear and dry. And you can do all the same sports in Minnesota that you can do in Minnesota, but they're even better because you have the mountains.
Yeah.
So Colorado might be a good one. Yeah.
Great. I always love this comparison between Kyrgyzstan and some states.
I mean, the agricultural part of Minnesota reminds me of Kyrgyzstan, but then the mountains, like the way the countryside looks, reminds me of Colorado. So that's a good question.
Great. Thank you very much, Kirsten and Thomas, for the fantastic, super fascinating presentation. It was really great to learn more about Minnesota State. And also, I would like to say thank you to our viewers who sent us their questions and comments. They're great. And of course, I think some of your wishes will come true, and you will visit Minnesota State as you wish. And just want to say, please stay healthy these days and have a great day and great evening. So, Kirsten and Thomas, once again, thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Aisa.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your good questions, too.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Aisa.
Bye. Bye.